and we'll get started. So hello, I am known as Talina Di Giuseppe da Fiesole. I live in the barony of Rivenoak in the Principality of Sinagua in the Kingdom of the West. And today we're going to talk about olive oil. You've probably got a bottle or two or more in your kitchen, but one thing that I learned working for an olive oil producer was that most people don't actually know all that much about it, even cooks. So we're just going to spend some time really getting to know the ingredient. And I think I have mentioned to some of y'all that this is the first time I'm teaching this. And honestly, I'm kind of at the beginning of my research in this topic, just kind of tippy-toeing down into the rabbit hole. But I think it's really interesting, so I wanted to share with you. So that being said, you know how you have a class in mind, and then the research doesn't really go the direction you thought it would? So originally, I kind of wanted to take a step-by-step look at modern versus like ancient or period oil production. And like ancient seemed like a great place to start. We have these really beautiful Roman agriculture guides that include all of cultivation. And so after reading Cato's like 110 million pages on the exact specifications for Roman olive mills, I was like, all right, we're going to get to making oil. We're going to get to the actual process. Yeah. He's like, I hire someone. So both Cato and Columella really get a lot of specifics into equipment, but they give kind of a vague executive summary overview of the process. It's kind of clearly missing some key steps and really hyper-focused on others. Sort of how to watch an expert who has brought in most of their own trained labor do a thing and then nitpick them is kind of how I think of their description. So I was kind of disappointed on that front that I couldn't get this sort of side-by-side comparison. But what I realized is that there are a lot of really great key like clues into what preferences they had. So what they're trying to do in kind of a positive manner and what they're trying to avoid, that we can really draw some parallels to our modern processes and sort of maybe like tease out some characteristics that they would have been trying to obtain. So in this class, we are going to primarily be looking at kind of ancient Roman versus modern. So on the historical side, I just wanted to show you what resources we're looking at. Forgive my Latin, it sucks. So our even ancient Roman accounts will be those of Marcus Porcius Cato, or Cato the Elder. And so he wrote De Re Agricultura, which you'll see as on agriculture or on farming, as we have it here, around 160 BCE. So up here, you can just see what translation I am using. And then we have Lucius Janus Moderus Columella, who wrote a book that we generally will call De Re Rustica, but it is and you will, or on rustic affairs, you will hear it titled a lot of different ways because this is in fact 12 books that make up this work. And that was published sometime prior to his death in 70 AD. Of those 12 books, olive oil is addressed in book 12, chapter 50. And I accidentally returned the copy I had to the library before I started on this. So I was looking for a facsimile. The only one I could find that actually included book 12, which is apparently not very popular, was from 1745. So they're out there. There is a link to the source on archive.org if you are interested. And then I am just going to touch on the Tecunium Sanctitatis. So this is the translation that I'm using. All right, we've gotten through that, but we're actually going to start here in the future. And the reason that we're doing that is that this olive oil that we produce now is what you can get, right? It's all fine and dandy to talk about ancient Roman olive oil, but we need to know how that relates to the product we can actually buy and use now. So I am basing most of the modern information on my industry experience. I worked as the director of inventory and production planning for a company called Lucero Olive Oil, who unfortunately they're no longer in operation. But when I worked for them, we grew and milled 16 different varieties of olives. And that was in Corning, California, which at the time was the US kind of center of olive production. If you would like to learn more about modern oil production, these links, and I will make this slideshow available. I believe the handouts are going to go into a Google Drive after the event. But there are some links here that are kind of fun to go through. If you do look at the USDA standards guide, which I'm going to call fun, I highly recommend looking at the version with commentary where they defend what each criteria is. If you want some good bureaucracy, that's the way to go. So first thing we're going to do is get some quick parameters on olive oil, because I want you, when you look at a bottle of olive oil, I want you to know what the words mean. And this is going to give us our baseline of what we value in modern olive oil so that we can kind of compare that to what they're valuing in this ancient olive oil. Okay, so modern olive oil is sold in a variety of grades. We are going to concentrate on the kind of commercial grades, which are going to be extra virgin olive oil, and olive oil. So this actually comes from the this is actually from the USDA standards. And so virgin, extra virgin, those aren't just kind of marketing speak. Those are actually really well-defined levels. And so these are kind of the characteristics. So there are 3 sort of parameters under which olive oil is graded. So the first is going to be process parameters, so how it's actually made. Then we'll have quantitative testing, which if on this little table starts in B and C, we start running chemical tests, and qualitative assessment, which is what that top portion is. There are lots of different governing bodies depending on where you are, and there's also some additional certifying agencies, and all the standards, they do vary a little bit, and I'll try and point out places where we do have big variances. I am most familiar with, and so what we were going to use here are the USDA standards. So USDA and COOC, which is the California Olive Oil Coalition, are actually some of the strictest in the world. So that's what I am used to producing under, and I'll try and catch those spots where they are very different from some of the European standards. So the first thing to know is production parameters. So just to get on the board as olive oil, you'll hear things like cold pressed, first pressing. Those don't mean a lot. They are kind of marketing jargon. What we're looking for when we are looking at oils is the word virgin. If virgin is in the name, the oil is required to be milled by mechanical means with no processing of the olives beyond washing and sorting. The resulting olive mash can't be heated beyond what's required for processing. Generally, that's going to be around 80-ish degrees, and depending on ambient temp, they might be cooling, they might be heating. So if it doesn't have virgin in the name, so if it doesn't have virgin, it's just olive oil, it means that it can actually be extracted using chemical processes. And so that could either be chemical processing of the olive mash, or more commonly, they will chemically process to strip out oil that is exhibiting an unacceptable level of defect, and we will get into what that means. All right, so the next portion we're going to talk about is going to be the quantitative testing. So there are several chemical analysis tests that are performed on sample oil from each production run. We're not going to get into a ton of detail here, but the tests are looking at things like oleic acid content, peroxide value, fatty acid composition, moisture and volatile matter content, that kind of thing. So on this grading chart, they start at B and C, but the thing that we want to see, and they kind of continue on. There are a whole lot of different chemical tests that are run. We're going to come back here because so each test has really specific parameters that are for each grade. And so as an example, if we look at UV absorbency, which is D on this list, you'll see that to be extra virgin, it's got to be equal to or less than 0.22, whereas to be virgin, it could go all the way up to 0.25. So while a lot of the parameters are pretty solid between those two grades, there are some places where they differ. So if your oil does not make the parameters of these tests, it generally, what it indicates is that something went wrong in the processing. So it could be the actual processing of the oil, it could be during the storage, it could be orchard management, your olives were too ripe, that kind of thing. But really what it tells us is that that oil is not going to remain at quality for very long. And one of the reasons that we do this chemical testing is it's going to maybe bring forward some things that we might not be able to tell when we get into the qualitative assessments. So that is where we're going next. Okay, so qualitative assessments. Once we've passed the chemical analysis, the next step is to make sure it actually tastes like that grade of oil. So that is done using organoleptic assessment, so using our senses. And there are kind of two areas that trained tasters are looking for in flavor. They're going to look for positive attributes. They're going to look for negative attributes. The tasting is always going to be done by a panel. And when all of the sort of like classifications are going to use the median score of that panel. So I actually had the pleasure of attending a course at the Robert Mondavi Olive Oil Center at UC Davis to kind of learn that tasting process so that I could be part of the internal assessment panel at the mill that I worked for. So in our table of standards that is above me, and I promise we're going to get out of the boring stuff at some point here, in our table of grades that are above me in the first section. So section A is where all of our sort of qualitative assessment lives. So the first piece on there is going to be odor and flavor. That is an overall score. And it is done on this excellent, good, poor, acceptable sort of spectrum. And what it is they're going to look at the level of positive attributes and any negative flavor attributes and score it in that way. And so on the positive side, what they are looking for is going to be the median fruitiness. Fruitiness is basically the way that they talk about any positive flavor attributes. And those are going to be things like flavors of olive, apple, green, yes, green, sweet, grass, nutty, tomato, tomato leaf, floral, green almond, all of those lovely, nice flavors that we like to have in an oil. If an oil is not, like, it's one-dimensional, it's got a lot of grassy flavor, but that's all it's got. It's not a deal breaker. Generally, what people will do is they'll take that oil and they will blend it with other oil from either other pressings or from other varieties to kind of balance out the flavors and make a really delicious oil. I will say that the vast majority of oils that are sold now are blends. And so unless it's specifically labeled as a single variety, it is most likely to be a blend. Blends will tend to be a little bit on the kind of sweeter, fruitier side than many of the single variety, where you may actually get that really strong peppery flavor or a really strong bitter that might not be exhibited when you blend a bunch together. One type of blend that you may see marked on a bottle is something called a field blend. That is when you are actually growing several varieties of olives in the same orchard and just harvesting them and mixing them all together as you harvest and mill. Okay, so we've done the positive side. Now we're going to go on to the negative side, which is of course more fun. So tasters are also going to look for unfavorable flavors, and those are referred to as defects. If there is a defect, there's no coming back. If the oil has a defect, then it's probably coming down a grade. So if you look at this second point on here, the median defect, you can see that to be extra virgin, you have to have 0 defects. Virgin oil can have a defect score of equal or less than 2.5. If it is above, in the US, if it is above a median defect of 2.5, it is considered lampante. So lampante is kind of the industry term for not fit for human consumption without additional processing. This is a place where some of the international standards do vary quite a bit. There are a lot of regions that find a defect score of up to 6 to be acceptable for virgin oil. Okay, so now, oh, and if an oil is defective, so it has too many defects, it has too many unfavorable flavors, it can be additionally processed to strip those flavors out, but it loses the virgin title. And so it could be chemically stripped of those off flavors and sold as olive oil. All right, so now let's get into what the actual defects are. So the most common defects, so this cool little wheel that is above me is one of the training tools they use when they teach people to do tasting. And the most common defects are going to be fusty, muddy sediment, musty, rancid, and winey vinegary. You'll see that there are some other things on here. Some of them are a little bit more intuitive, like metallic, probably means that it has been like sullied with something that is not olive oil. But some are a little bit less so, like frozen. Frozen actually refers to olives that were hit with a hard frost, and oil subsequently made of those olives has a super distinct flavor that is kind of like stewed fruit. It's not quite right. But one of the things about these defects is they're not just preferences. So I might not like a very bitter oil, but that doesn't mean it's defective. So this little snapshot out of the USDA guidelines is giving us a good clue as to what these defects mean. When I taste this thing, it means this thing is happening in the oil. So when we talk about an oil that is fusty, it is an oil where probably when the olives were harvested before they were milled, some sort of bacterial growth has started to happen in kind of some specific strains of bacteria, and it gives it a really specific flavor. So generally speaking, a lot of defects happen at the time that you're as you're moving your olives from your orchard to your mill. So fusty, musty is going to be kind of mold growth based, and then winey vinegary is actually going to be yeast based. So, and that'll start a fermentation process, which is not favorable. So all of these things, what we're tasting and looking for are actual specific things happening in the oil that are going to either make it not taste great, like muddy sediment. That is sediment in the oil rotting. That's not going to be good. It's not good food. But they're either going to indicate something that just makes it not good food, or they're going to indicate something that's going to reduce the shelf life of that oil. So rancidity is a little bit different than the other defects in that it can develop over time. All oils will become rancid eventually. And so that is something where an oil cannot be rancid and then subsequently be rancid. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the actual process. So we've talked about what we look for in modern oil. So let's talk about how we make it. So this is kind of just a quick overview of the actual process, and we're going to talk a little bit more about each of the steps. So the olives are picked, they might be stored, they're washed, the oil is extracted. I have these two little blue boxes. The top one is our modern process. They are crushed, malaxed, decanted. And in our Roman process, they are milled and pressed. The next step is racking. Some producers now use filters. And then in the last step, they are bottled or somehow otherwise put into their final storage vessel. So again, we come back to that caveat where both Cato and Columella, they cover oil production, but Cato tells us straight up, I hire somebody to do this. Here are the things I put in my contract. And Columella is vague enough on the actual process to assume that he probably does that as well. And so while their specifications on equipment are really precise, the actual process really is from kind of a supervising an expert stance. So we will have to do a little bit of extrapolation. All right, so the first component, and this is picking. And for us, this is also going to include the kind of when we pick. But this is where we get our first clue regarding sort of the ancient oils versus the modern oils. So our first clue is in trees like this picture. Olive trees live a long time. They can produce fruit for like 1,000 years. And kind of what that means is that generations of plants are really long. So in our kind of traditionally olive producing areas, it means the selective breeding changes over time are going to be pretty slow unless there is some other technological force that is asking them to change. So we could potentially be eating olives that are only 1 or 2 generations, maybe 3 generations away from olives that were eaten in Roman times, which is kind of cool. But that portion gets a little bit trickier when we start looking at newer olive producing regions like California and Australia, which are really big in oil. I will say California has actually been growing table olives since the 18th century. We've had mission olives, but we're kind of new to this large scale oil game. If you happen to have driven through Central California in the last like 15 years, you will have seen these kind of hedgerows of olive trees. They look absolutely like hedges. They are planted in something that is referred to as super high density. And the reason that they do that is so that they can take these giant mechanical pickers through, and they drive over the rows and actually mechanically pick them. Thing is, that's really new. That's probably about the last 15 years. Or sorry, maybe the last 20 to 30 years that we have had mechanical picking widespread in olive production. So in these newer regions where we have adopted the new technology because we don't have older traditions really quickly, you will have a higher percentage that are produced in these really modern manners. And so selecting varieties for super high density planting is probably the biggest change in olive production that has happened recently. Like our equipment has changed, but the actual like end-to-end processes have not changed drastically, but selecting trees to do this is a thing. There are still quite a few olives that are handpicked. So if you were curious about what varieties are going to be in that super high density, the most common are going to be Arbequina, Arbesana, and Kornecki. So if you see those varieties labeled on a bottle, 9 times out of 10, they were probably grown in super high density. And so a lot of them are still handpicked. Anything that makes a table olive is handpicked. So like even if you get a, you know, a can of black olives for 50 cents at the grocery store, those were handpicked. And so not all table olives make great oil olives. So Columella notes for us that larger olives make better eating varieties and smaller are better for oil, which is definitely something that holds true in my experience. So Cato and Columella they note several different varieties of olive, none of which I was super familiar with in modern production. And so that's an area that I'm excited to dig into more. But there were a few olive oil sites that did say Oresetes, is I'm guessing how it's pronounced, is actually still in production in regions of Italy. So there are still people growing the same varieties of olives that they were growing in Roman times. So when things do get handpicked, they can either be physically picked into a basket, or the trees can have tarps or rugs, or in Cato and Columella's time, reed mats placed under them, and then they are either shaken or beaten with sticks. And so that is actually still something that's practiced both in kind of traditional orchards and in modern orchards. All right, so then we'll get into this other portion of picking, because picking is a big area. So olives are typically picked slightly underripe for curing. So in this sort of ripeness chart, you have when you are going to just like make olives and cure them to eat, you're probably going to pick them somewhere between 2 and 3. Whereas for oil, you do want them to get a little bit riper. Sorry. There is kind of a sweet spot though. The riper the olive, the more oil it will produce. But once you get past that sweet spot of where you are kind of at the optimum amount of oil for the best flavor, the flavor starts really getting worse. So Cato notes that the greener olives, the greener the olives, the better the oil. But the riper olive will yield more words. Sorry. So he tells us that the greener the olives, the better the oil, but that it will pay the owner best to have oil made from riper olives. So what he's kind of indicating there is that you get that higher yield the riper you are, but that the quality of the oil does go down. And if anybody has had the pleasure of having an oil that is made from very ripe olives, probably the most common flavor note that I would put to it is cat pee. It's not my favorite. So that's something that our ancient Roman gentleman farmers are also valuing, right? And so one thing that Columella did want to note for us, though, is that if you pick the olives too early, that the oil will be really bitter. So they're also saying, hey, hit this sweet spot. There's also some great descriptions where they're saying that some of the olives are white and some are turning black. So if you look at this little picture of this kind of twig with some olives on it, that's most likely how you're going to see olives when they get picked for oil, is a combination of olives that are a little bit riper and a little bit less ripe, and you would pick the whole tree at once. So you get sort of a little bit of a mix. So when I was doing olive oil, we grew 16 different varieties, and all the varieties are going to ripen at different times. So we were milling from kind of late September through January, but our biggest milling window was mid to late November through mid December. That was when we were doing the most milling. And Cato actually does note for us that the best oil is produced in early December. So that really kind of jives with us. So they're only growing a few varieties, and they're saying we pick in this kind of window, and that produces the best oil. And so if we do jump forward to the Tecunium santitatis, that is a hard word, when they actually talk about olive oil, they have when things are optimum. So their optimum is something that the translator couldn't read, and then it says good month. So it is possible that they are also actually indicating that they are looking at oils that are produced in a good month. When it comes into that kind of olive oil grading, the ancient Romans don't have the same sets of criteria that we do, but they did have grades that are lower that are produced later. Okay, so now let's jump on to storage. So here's the thing about storing olives. We don't want to. And so the olive harvest and milling, it needs to move really quickly. Columella even recommends that you have a store of firewood available before harvest, because once the harvest starts, you can't call those workers away. So here's, olives are fruit, and fruit rots. So modernly, our goal is really to move the olives directly from the orchard to the mill. A lot of times now that will be done in kind of like open semi-truck trailers, where they pick directly into the trailer, they pull up to the mill, they open a hatch on the bottom, and that goes straight into the conveyor belt that brings them into the mill. Like, no waiting. So both Cato and Columella also are telling us that they want to move very quickly. They don't want to store their olives. They're both recommending against that. Modernly, we're going to try to process everything within 24 hours, preferably less than 6. And if they have to be stored, we do so under temperature control. But again, we're not going to really get over that 24-hour sort of window. And if we think back to those defects that we talked about, we have 3 types of defects that will form at the point where we are storing our olives. And those are going to be fusty, which is bacterial growth, musty, which is mold growth, and winey vinegary, which is yeast growth. So we really want to move as quickly as we can to prevent those things from happening, because once they start, they've started. So both Columella and Cato recommend storing olives for as short a time as possible. Cato actually gives guidelines to his contractors that he's hiring that they can store for up to a day. He does have this interesting note that if the olives have frozen because they got hit by a hard frost, that you can actually store them for 3 or 4 days to bring them back up to temperature. So while they're saying don't store them, Columella has this really interesting portion where he details out how to build in storage in case you have to. And his storage recommendations are focused on minimizing rot, and he's specifically looking at reducing moisture. So it's possible that mustiness was kind of the larger issue for them with that kind of December harvest window. And the next step is going to be washing. We don't do anything special. We use water. It is just water. And the same with the Romans. Okay. So now we're going to get into the actual extraction of oil. This is where our ancient Roman friends, they get a little fuzzy. And it's also really the area of biggest difference, but we'll kind of run through what that process looks like. So modernly, the process is going to be crushing, malaxing, decanting. So crushing is going to be crushing with a mill. Modern mills tend to be masticating, so they will have a set of teeth that grind up the olives. Malaxing is mixing. So they will be moved into that olive mash will be moved into large vats and mixed under kind of a consistent temperature. And then decanting is going to be the process of separating the olive pulp from the oil. And that modernly is generally done using a centrifuge. So that is going to, obviously, those are very modern techniques that get us to the oil. The Romans have different techniques that also get us to the oil. So the Romans have milling, pressing. Cato has something with a shell. So their process, well, they don't give the best step-by-step on what they're doing based on the equipment and some of the descriptions. What we can get is that the olives are pulped using stone mills. The mills are adjusted to make sure that they don't crush the pits. Because if the pits get in there, they give an off flavor to the oil. Columella is super excited about the adjustability. So that resulting pulp is going to be pressed through baskets. That's going to kind of separate out the bulk of the pulp from the actual oil. And that's going to be collected. Cato's got this crazy thing that I am picturing as somebody running around with a little tiny shell, moving the oil from the presses to the vats, but I'm guessing that is not exactly what's happening. So I will note there are still some modern producers that use stone mills, but they're fairly rare. And if they do, it's going to be on the packaging. It's mostly a marketing point. In California, I know there was at least one producer using a stone mill into the 2000s, but if I remember correctly, they couldn't meet the oxidation parameters when guidelines were tightened, and so they had to modernize. So you're much less likely to see stone milled in the US because they have trouble meeting the guidelines for quality. All right, so now we're back with details. They have so many details on racking. Racking is the next step. If you are a brewer or familiar with brewing, you might have you might have heard this word. It is the same process. So basically what racking is you put the oil into a vessel, you let the sediment sort of sink to the bottom, and then you take the oil off the top. And you keep doing that as many times as you need to get the level of clarity that you want. If you will recall back to our defects, muddy sediment is the defect that we could introduce here. So if we get too much sediment in the bottom of our bottles and we store our oil on it a long time, that sediment will begin to rot and you will taste rotting, and that's not ideal. So modernly we might rack 2-3 times because we have those fancy centrifuges. Columella indicates that they're moving through 10 rounds of racking based on his equipment specifications. And Cato recommends, if possible, to draw the oil off twice a day because the longer the oil sits on the dregs and pulp, the worse it is. Like that's kind of how he puts it. So he really is recognizing the same things we are. And his equipment lists seem to indicate about 12 moves. And so each subsequent racking is going to result in a cleaner oil. And so that's going to help us avoid that kind of that muddy sediment. And it's also, if we have other stuff that has gotten into our pulp, like onto our olives, we may be able to avoid getting a really developed winey vinegary flavor if we have removed a lot of that pulp and don't have as much for fermentation to happen on. So based on the kind of degree of attention that both Cato and Columella have put on the racking process, it is fairly clear that they are also really concerned with quality issues, and they've been pretty specific that they are really trying to avoid sitting on sediment, which is the same issue that we're trying to avoid modernly. And a better racked oil, a more clean oil, is going to have a longer shelf life. It is a little bit hard to tell from the text that I was looking at what shelf life they anticipate for oil back in ancient Rome. I am hoping that as I move forward in this research and we're looking more at merchant guides, that is going to give me a better clue. And so a lot of modern producers, while many of them still rack, a lot of them do use filters. When I was at Lucero, we racked kind of traditional racking, but we did buy a filter. And so we actually did a side-by-side comparison using both chemical and the organoleptic assessments, and found that mechanically filtered and racked oil from the same pressing were really similar. their taste, the qualities, really it wasn't impacted by that filtration process. It's not something that's going to be marked on your oil, but it really doesn't seem to make a big difference. Okay, so our last step in kind of production is going to be what we do with the actual oil. So modernly, bulk and bottled oil is generally stored in kind of temperature controlled environments. We used around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Columella notes for us the use of an oil cellar. So that's actually probably going to provide them a similar temperature stabilization. So upon completing of the racking process, Cato and Columella are noting that storage should be done in clay vessels. And modernly, you'll notice that a lot of extra virgin olive oil is in tinted glass, which also similarly blocks light, and exposure to light can contribute to the degradation of the oil over time. So that brings us through our oil production process. And this is kind of where we're going to leave off our adventures with our ancient Roman gentleman farmers. So what I'm hoping that you kind of can see from this is that while our equipment and some of our like step-by-step processing has changed quite a bit, the concerns and objectives of olive oil producers today are really remarkably similar to the concerns and objectives of those in the past. And as I continue down this rabbit hole, I look forward to sharing with y'all more. I am going to stop the recording.